Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. I'm in Toronto, but we have a very different kind of program starting this time. This is Schmooze number one. And with a schmooze party, I've invited some of my friends who mostly don't know each other to get together and get acquainted online. People who I think would like each other and find things to talk about. So here we're going to schmooze together with no agenda, but a really huge raft of wonderful, exciting people. In Afghanistan, in Kabul, there's Corey Levine, who's working with UN Women on behalf of the Afghan women. Here in Toronto, we have two people who do know each other, Doug Saunders and Liz Renzetti, who are both high-powered columnists at the Globe and Mail. In Vancouver, we have Paul Meyer, who is a former ambassador for disarmament. Canadians have an ambassador for disarmament, not every country does. And Paul has been that and is now has been working on other issues, diplomatic issues and international affairs, especially disarmament issues in the last several years. He's also the head of the Canadian Pugwash Movement group. And in Vienna, we have Tariq Ralph, who is a specialist on nuclear weapons and actually all things nuclear. He's working, I think, at the IAEA these days. Isn't that right, Tariq?
I sort of finished working at the IAEA.
All right. Well, anyway, you have your finger in many pies. So welcome, everybody. And we don't know where this is going to go, but I think you will all have things of interest to share. I would like Doug to begin by launching whatever kind of question he would like to put to anybody, and we'll see. Everybody jump in, and you can disagree or whatever you want to do.
I could spend an hour with each of you, but let's start with Corey, just because it's rare enough that you have somebody with a good line from Kabul available to ask about these things. One of the I haven't been to Afghanistan since the 2000s and have tried to follow it. But one of the things that the Americans and Canadians and other NATO members kept saying in defense of the very extended military operation there / peace and stabilization operation there was that although most things didn't seem to have worked or changed things for the better, in terms of economy or violence or political leadership. One thing that they've been saying all along is that the rights of women have improved, the participation of women has improved, at least over 1999, say. And of course, there's worries that now that the Taliban are in a position to take over a lot more power, that it might revert to 1999 levels. Corey, how do you see it? I mean, how much better did things get over the last 20 years? And how stable are those improvements such as they are?
I've been coming in and out of Afghanistan for almost 20 years now. So I've had the privilege to see how the country has unfolded post 9/11. And I think your remarks were spot on with regard to the utter failure of the peace and stabilization project. And I will put that in quotation marks because I think that's where it needs to be. And right there, I think is one of the keys to why women's rights is such at a fragile state at this point in time. And I think it's really important to remember, though, the Americans used the line after 9/11, Laura Bush came on and talked about women's rights and blah, 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 when we all knew what it was really about, and it had nothing to do with women's rights. And the international community has been paying fabulous lip service to women's rights. But when we look at behind of how the international community has engaged engaged from about 2005 on. They traded, peace and stabilization for security. And again, women's rights were weighing down their engagement here. So they felt like what could they toss out of their engagement while still paying lip service to this? So this is another issue. But I think the important thing to say at the moment, we have to remember that although the Taliban when they were in power, I mean, they just committed egregious violations to the population as a whole, but especially to women. But they only represented what has been culturally part of this. They took it to the most extreme and the most egregious level. But women and girls, goats, frankly, have had more rights here in Afghanistan. When the Taliban say will bring about, we'll hold on to, the gains that women have made. It's been sort of in and out. Women. There's been strong Afghan women's voices here, to be sure, like right from the beginning. There's always been some kind of, not Ministry of Women's Affairs, but that exists now, but some kind of women's council. So you have the extremes of where females have had very little rights, but at the same time, they have been part of the fabric of Afghan society. Women here are extremely worried about what will happen in negotiations. The international community seems to have no real interest other than saying we have the red lines. They're more interested in...
Do they think that what will be coming back is the kind of actual brutality that we saw filmed so often before, early on, women being beaten and absolutely unable to leave their houses and so on? Is that really over? And do they think that is coming back? Will come back?
Yeah, they are worried about this. I mean, the Taliban have proposed this FICA council, a religious council. What will that mean? Yeah, I mean, women are worried. There are signs in the Taliban-controlled areas of Afghanistan, and that runs anywhere from 40 to 70%. Nobody really knows how much of the country that the Taliban actually control at the minute. You see girls' schools being closed down. You see women being forced back into Purdah, no longer able to participate in public life. It is a real worry. But also, what exists now that didn't post 9/11 is, Islamic State presence. Who knows what, the Taliban, could easily, come to some agreement with them.
Rick, you're from Pakistan, and you mentioned that along with Liz, who's famously the major feminist that I know, writing about the rights of women every other column practically. So thank you for that, Liz. But Tariq, you say that you've been also engaged with the question of the status of women in Pakistan, your home country. What do you and Liz have to say about all of this?
Well, I've only been engaged at the very extreme margins. Mm-hmm. One of my class fellows is now the Minister for Human Rights there in the federal government. And she put through a bill that went through Parliament in ensuring that women receive their fair share of parental property when the parents die, and what's left to them in the wills of their parents. Because in one version of a Sharia law that people interpret, the male heirs get the majority of the property or whatever is left behind, and the women get very little. And in reality, they are deprived of whatever little is their share to begin with, that they never get to see it. So this law that is now exists provides a platform for women, if they feel that they've been deprived of their fair share, to sue in the courts to get this fair share, among other things. The big concern is that maybe the Taliban in the cities in Afghanistan might respect to some level women's rights, but the big problem will be in the countryside, where there will be less oversight and less media coverage. And I think it's, in my view, that's where the women will be driven back into the kitchen, back into the burqas, and girls' schools might be closed or severely curtailed. It's also Pakistan and Afghanistan are the only two countries in the world where polio is still there, because routinely polio vaccinators are killed, and particularly in the northern areas and in Afghanistan, they deny inoculation or vaccination against polio to newborn babies.
Sorry, this is because of the history that I assume that the fact that when they were looking for Osama bin Laden, they pretended to be vaccinators going door to door,
Yes,
and they've
this
created
is part of that. Yes, so the real nutcase religious hardliners believe that this is a Western conspiracy to sterilize the male children. And that's what the polio vaccine actually is, although it's made out to be polio vaccine. And even though there are cases of polio, they still do not learn from that had these poor children been vaccinated, they wouldn't have had the deformities that the children suffer as a result of getting polio.
I don't think we can speak with a great air of superiority to that particular belief, since there seem to be people in Western countries who have come to believe something very similar about the current COVID vaccines.
It's true. I would just ask Corey, I'm very interested, are there kind of levers that the international community can use at this point in order to do more than pay lip service to women's safety and also having access to public office and public power? Like, is there anything the international community can fundamentally and in fact do? And are they doing that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Liz. Donors are absolutely funding lots of programs for women, for girls, really trying to hold on to the gains that women have made. The Constitution was written with international support, where it's actually written into the text that men and women have equal rights. So we have seen that, but I think over the past few years, given going back to Doug's question, where it's been more or less an abject failure, that the donor community is trying to figure out how to cut their ties, their losses, and get out without too much further damage to their standing. This war is not popular in any of the domestic audiences, whether it's Canada or Australia or the UK. So I think, unfortunately, in the broader view, so while money is definitely going in to support women, I'm here working for UN Women. Canada is doing, a lot of programming on women's rights, but writ large, in the broader geopolitical sense, they'll do whatever they need to do to cut their losses and get out of town.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In this connection, there are, since we've got a good supply of diplomats here, and I'm always running into women saying, now, if we just have more women at the international table when when negotiations are going on for whatever, disarmament or the end of a conflict and so on. Women negotiators would be a lot better than these males. And I'm exaggerating, but there certainly, I gather, is an imbalance. What's the status of that? Are there any significant efforts to change the sex ratio in the diplomatic world in general? And what difference does it make, if any? I'll let anybody who's bold enough to tackle that question.
Can I just actually jump in here first, because I've done a little bit of looking at this from a more research policy point of view, and then I'm happy to turn it over to the actual diplomats in the room. But it does show that if there is a critical number of women at the table, it makes an absolute fundamental difference. You can see that in the Good Friday Agreement, where women were absolutely an integral and fundamental part of the agreement, and how that's worked out. I mean, study after study has shown that where women are not involved in the peace agreements, and there needs to be a critical mass and not just, one or two token women at the table, that it does make an absolute difference to the lives of women and girls.
Okay.
If I might, I was going to cite, similar research that Corey has, particularly on both involvement in the peace settlement process, but also in the peace building process, that there's a correlation between a greater meaningful participation by women and more successful results. I think, though, there can be trends to increase in, let's say, in the diplomatic services of countries, the number of women. That trend is observable in many countries, and that's positive. But I often like to stress it's not just the case of the gender disposition in the delegation. You have to look at who's actually shaping the policies that those delegates are instructed to carry out, and whether at those more senior levels you have adequate representation of women. And I think that's a much more problematic field. Indeed, a further bridge is to actually look at the feminist dimension of the policies. Are they reflecting a different concept of how, let's say, security should be advanced? I think.
So you're talking about what Canada calls our feminist foreign policy, right? Which
yes.
I've never fully understood. I hope somebody can enlighten me on what a feminist foreign policy is.
Well, the government has promised to come out with one. In fact, it was supposed to be this spring. I think it's yet to appear. There were consultations held. Canadian Pugwash submitted a brief, as did a number of other NGOs, and some of our points, indeed reflected concerns, because at an earlier stage, for instance, the Feminist International Development Policy was promulgated. There was absolutely no mention of disarmament in this, as if that a whole realm was somehow not of concern to feminists. In the most recent round, at least the discussion paper had some acknowledgement that might be something that women would be concerned about, like maybe opposing having weapons of mass slaughter, on hair trigger alert around the world. But we'll have to see, indeed, if those themes come out, because as you can imagine, they quickly rub up against governmental positions of a different stance, and acknowledging that maybe the reliance on nuclear deterrence and, as they say, mass atrocity posturing may not accord with so-called feminist values. So there's a lot to be, I think, said on that. But if I might, while I have sort of the floor, I wanted to ask Corey back. I mean, you were suggesting, I think, briefly about cultural norms, and you wonder after 20 years of Western involvement, of this immense international community engagement, does the Afghan population, at least that within government-controlled areas, has it actually absorbed cultural norms in a different way? I mean, is there now an acceptance of gender equality as an important element of the society, or is all this just so much water off a duck's back that these are concepts promulgated by outsiders that have never really been absorbed into the Afghan population itself? Clearly, the Taliban is resisting it, but I wonder those areas that have been exposed and benefited from huge amounts of aid and programming, has it really made a difference in the attitudes of ordinary Afghanis?
They preach the language of gender equality and this and that, but women's lives, I don't think, have changed hugely in the rural areas. It certainly changed, fundamentally in the urban areas where the government is still in control. But your question leads me to something that I have puzzled on for many years now. We work to impose this so-called Western liberal democracy on a country that has a very different understanding of what democracy is and what inclusion is. And I scratch my head at where do we go wrong every single time. We need to fundamentally rethink how we engage in intervention. For example, bringing elections to these countries have never worked out. And we continue to use elections as a barometer for success. It's a matter of coming with a whole new paradigm. So I'd really like to hear from my fellow schmoozers.
From nearly 20 years ago, there are UN Security Council resolutions on enhancing the role of women in international peace and security, and there is a Secretary General's report produced every year or every 2 years. If you go to the website of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR in Geneva, they've done a number of good papers on this issue, on the role of women in international peace and security and disarmament. Although I might add that the National Security Advisor of President Bush Jr. and also one of those of President Obama, both of those were women, and they were just as aggressive as any man might be in prosecuting drone strikes and foreign interventions. So it depends, I think, to pick up from Paul, from which country the people are coming from, whether they are men or women, and whether they've bought into the national narrative, whatever that might be. With regard to the second issue about women and Western interventions, one pattern of Western intervention of elections is to line people up, give them a piece of paper, and to put it in a ballot box. So that really is not democracy. A lot of the people are not well educated. They are still under the power influence of their tribes or tribal leaders or the local, whoever might be the power brokers. In many cases, they are given a little bit of money. They have a piece of paper, whether these symbols might be a cow, might be a cricket bat, might be a bicycle, and they're told where to put a cross and put it in the ballot. So that's not democracy, and no wonder these experiments don't work. With regard to the Taliban and Afghanistan, I'm really very unhappy that there is a level of pedophilia. This is sort of a very sensitive issue where all of these old men, they keep young boys for exploitative purposes, and the international forces have basically turned a blind eye to this. And so here is something that could be stopped. It's not that difficult. But you know, these billions of dollars that have come in from the US and others in the aid probe, they go to all these warmongers. Some of these are war criminals. They have been involved in killing of prisoners and so on. And then they end up serving as defense ministers or regional chiefs and so on. So it's a huge mess in Afghanistan, and I don't know where we start. So it's not only the rights of women, but also the rights of children and their exploitation in all worse manners that one can think about.
A point about Afghanistan has also always intrigued me is, you know, that all of this heavy foreign military assistance to the government of Afghanistan and its security forces, and yet they still seem to be losing ground to the Taliban. I'm not aware of the Taliban benefiting from any major foreign military advisors or equipment. Are the government Afghan soldiers just, you know, less competent, less motivated? I mean, it's just. I mean, the usual correlation of forces, as the Marxists would say, you know, would suggest that it should be the Taliban losing ground to the government's forces, but that doesn't seem to happen. But on Corey's broader point about the inadequacy of general Western models of peace building, democracy promotion, conflict resolution. There's a very good book out recently by Séverine Auxerre. I don't know if you're familiar with her writing. She's done a lot of field work in the DRC on matters. And I mean, in a nutshell, and this is probably not doing full service to her argument, it's that you have to rely on the locals, that you can't really have viable peace processes that are imposed from outside, or where the again, the primary actors, as someone commenting on this has noted, you look at the major NGOs that get involved. It's always the foreign staff who come in the leadership positions, and then they have sort of secondary and tertiary levels of maybe locals helping them out. But the locals are never in the driver's seat on their own processes, and you might argue, as she does, that you really need to see much more of that if you're going to have sustainable peace arrangements in the countries.
I think partly for what it's worth, that part of the problem with that equation is that you need to define who the locals are and which locals. And Afghanistan's a really acute version of that problem, because I mean, I don't completely feel that democratic institutions and so on are Western ideas that are necessarily imposed in Afghanistan. There was a tradition of their creation. They did emerge in Afghanistan, but after the Soviet invasion, the entire Afghan middle class left into exile. And although there was a brief period in 2001 when some of them talked about returning, it never got safe enough for that to happen. And those who did return went back into exile pretty quickly. And so you never had the actual middle class in the urban institutions and the university educated people and so on who would be able to grip hold of that. I always thought the counterinsurgency plans that were drawn up by United States and Canada and Britain to guide their missions, which read like these wonderful surveys of the history of sociology, and just these, terrific documents about exactly how to overcome these problems and so on, sort of fell into vapor because, first of all, they were being delivered by soldiers who are not very well equipped to deliver public policy to a poor country. And it never got to the point where you could have anyone but soldiers deliver it, because even if you had, graduate sociologists delivering these things, you had to have 30 soldiers around each of them when they went into a village, making sure they were safe so effectively. But second, it was delivered to a group of locals who were self-selected, often with tribal dynamics behind them that with self-declared legitimacy that didn't relate to the actual populations. And without any of that middle class present that would allow the democratic institutions to take hold in a legitimate way, or the rights associated with those things. And I don't know what the lessons are in the future, other than that I don't think any of those great counterinsurgency plans of trying to staple a social change program onto a military invasion and occupation will ever work. You know, maybe we should have had an international intervention of a not particularly military nature in Afghanistan in 1998 or 1999, but stapling it onto the eradication of foreign Arab terrorist groups from the country was never going to work. And of course, as Corey says, you now have Arab terrorist groups using the country as a stronghold once again.
Yeah, you're definitely right, Doug. Where I would quibble with is state building has not really taken hold here. It hasn't had the opportunity to literally breathe and find its way. But part of that is because we did impose ways and views and systems of governance and state infrastructure that doesn't suit the Afghan context. And I can't tell you how many countries that I've seen it in. I mean, the international community just kind of threw out the baby with the bathwater. To go back to Tarek's point, I mean, elections here, I have been watching them right from the beginning when they were held. There has, of course, been always democratic systems of governance coming from local councils or shuras or jirgas, but instead, I mean, there were jirgas held here, but that was dispensed with once we brought in Western style of, elections. And maybe Afghans want elections, and certainly the first time that elections were held, it was an amazing thing to watch women voting for the first time, holding up their finger showing their stain that they had voted. But now there is so much cynicism around elections, the same way that it is in Canada or the US, about the natures of the political elites here, and that they don't represent the interests. And I'm not sure if it was you or someone else who spoke about, the local power, dynamics of the powerful families, and they're the ones that control the power. And none of this was taken into account. If you don't mind, I'll share with you a story of when I was here in 2002, and the first large Loya Jirga Grand Council was being held in Kabul in a month, a couple of months after I was there. And I had the privilege of wandering around the country. It was safe to do that. Then I went and met a local warlord in an unnamed province who was going to participate in the Loya Jirga to determine the interim government before elections could be held. And I went to meet him in the middle of nowhere. And so we were chatting, and, you know, it was a journalist's dream because you could ask all these questions and they didn't understand that they could, you know, like maybe it wasn't good to share the information that they were. So I was asking how he was funding his enterprise. And he said, well, the Americans basically show up once a month with a trunk full of dollars. And I was like, okay, which Americans, you know, is it like the CIA or, you know, who is it? He absolutely couldn't tell me. And then he went on to become the governor of the province that, you know, I met him in. And so this was a classic example of, you know, funding the warlords on the one hand with one chunk of money from, you know, who knows how they managed to, you know, state what it was in the budget. And then, you know, USAID funding all these programs to bring, you know, peace and stabilization and state building to the country. And so, you know, right there was the classic example of, you know, undermining, you know, the process of state building on the one hand and trying to build it up on the other hand. He even took me to his private landing strip where he, you know, we went there, all his, you know, his army was standing there saluting him. And, you know, I found out a little later that he used this landing strip to smuggle antiquities out of the country. So, and here we were completely supporting him, you know, and encouraging him to be appointed as a governor. So, while I'm saying that, you know, the international community is not at fault for this, but we do have complicity here. And it goes back to your point. It's like, who is being represented? And this is the problem. In countries like this, there are the power brokers that will continue to be the power brokers no matter what system of government is here.
That's the most depressing analysis I've heard.
Oh dear. I guess I am so sorry.
Tariq had earlier mentioned, I mean, he's been involved with the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the organizations that monitor it. And of course, he's in Vienna as the talks around the JCPOA agreement with Iran are going on outside his door, practically. Paul, of course, also has an eye on and experience with these things. The way I would loop these together is to ask, aside from the question of whether these talks are going to bring the JCPOA back to where it was in 2015 or improve it, I'm interested in the question of whether the JCPOA is an interesting model for how the international community can make a more beneficial intervention. I think what's interesting about it is it takes this sort of dull instrument of sanctions and flips them on their head by saying, here's a way we can trade end of sanctions for monitored compliance. In this case of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it could apply to other things. Now, aside from the question of whether this was needed for Iran or whether it's to what extent it's working, are there lessons to take from this procedure with Iran that could be applied in other contexts, maybe even for countries that are not NPT signatories, which I think are a bigger worry now?
I will underscore the fact that it was a diplomatic solution to a long-standing problem. I feel that we need much more emphasis on trying to find diplomatic solutions rather than militarized reflexes to every problem on the international scene. Plus, I think it's also noteworthy it was a multilateral diplomatic solution that involved the P5 plus Germany, and of course the P5 have particular status and responsibility. They also, in the NPT context, constitute the 5 nuclear weapon states party to the treaty. And this was longstanding. I mean, Tariq knows this much more intimately than I do, but I think it dates back to 2003 when the EU, when the agency first, said there were problems, and the EU tried to, as a troika, come up with a negotiation. So it took until 2015 before you actually had a solution to what was a challenge to the integrity of the non-proliferation regime. I mean, as you know, Iran is a party to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state, and the suspicions about the true nature of its nuclear program obviously had animated the international community for a long, long time. And to have a diplomatic solution in the form of a really detailed accord. I mean, it's 100 pages plus, and if you get into the detail, you could see Melbourne was trusting one another. I mean, this was providing for unprecedented intrusive verification in return for this economic sanction relief. So I see a lot of merit. I hope that the destructive actions of Trump can be sort of overcome, but you can see the little dance that's going on. The mere fact that they can't have direct negotiations in Vienna is the big impediment to effective negotiation. We hope to have it restored, and it suggests a route forward in dealing with other problems that can arise. So I see it very positively.
Yeah, I have long believed that sanctions have never worked in reversing a weapons of mass destruction program. Didn't work against South Africa, didn't work against Iraq, Iran, Libya, Syria, Pakistan, India, and North Korea. Because as the price rises when the sanctions are imposed on these countries, it's the populations that pay the price. It's not the leaderships, and we have seen it across the board. So Paul is absolutely right, but we need to rewind very quickly the Iran file back why they did this, although this is not a justification. But Iran was attacked more than 3 times with chemical weapons by Iraq during the Iraq-Iran war. There were United Nations reports on this, but then the international community did absolutely nothing. And that's where we trace the origins of the Iranian program to look into developing nuclear weapons. And so, although this is what they mentioned to the agency, we never accepted this as a justification, although we said we can understand your motivation, but you were still in violation of your nuclear non-proliferation treaty obligations, where you were supposed to declare all of your nuclear activities, and all of your nuclear activities are supposed to be exclusively for peaceful purposes. Now, in the JCPOA, Iran never fully got sanctions relief. Even under Obama, they only got partial sanctions relief. So, and then and since the JCPOA was underscored by United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231, it gave it even more status than an agreement which was not an international treaty. Now, in the Security Council Resolution 2231, the Americans smuggled in an element on ballistic missiles, which they were not able to get in the JCPOA talks. So towards the end of that resolution, it says Iran should not engage in ballistic missile activity that is associated with weapons of mass destruction. So it's sort of very loose. And so and then the Trump administration basically jettisons this. So if you are North Korea, you are seeing a country made an agreement, and the JCPOA was front-end loaded. Iran had to reduce its enrichment activities, cut down this number of centrifuges from 20,000 to about 6,000, get rid of enriched uranium above 300 kilograms, send it outside the country, and so on. And then the partial sanctions relief came, and the money that was being held up by the US was sent to Iran. So here, if you are North Korea, you're saying, well, here somebody reached an agreement and another administration walked away from this. So I don't see the JCPOA in that sense as being a good model, largely because of the actions of one country. I mean, there have been 100 reports on the Iranian program since 2003. And in none of those reports did the IAEA say that it found diversion of nuclear material from civil to military or a nuclear weapon. And the JCPOA was working fine. It's only the Trump administration under the influence of Israel that, you know, put this obstacle in there. So we have damaged the nuclear non-proliferation regime.
Could I ask a question? Well, because you say that, I wonder how they did this. It's like, did I understand you? They had an agreement and then there was an additional something sneaked in to it that wasn't there originally, and North Korea is looking at that and saying that might happen to us too. How did this happen? What was this extra something sneaked in? Or did I misunderstand you?
No, you're correct. So in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action negotiations, which culminated on the 14th of July, 2015, the United States wanted to bring the issue of ballistic missiles, or Iran's ballistic missiles program, also to be included in the JCPOA. The Iranians refused. So in the end, in order to get the nuclear agreement, the Obama administration did not push for inclusion of Iran's ballistic missiles in the JCPOA. But then when the JCPOA was taken by the US to the Security Council to get it approved in a resolution, in that resolution, they put in a provision that Iran's ballistic missile activities should not be directed towards delivery system for weapons of mass destruction.
It was the US it was the US that tacked that on. Not
the US tacked it on, yeah. But the other 4 permanent members went along with it, as did the European Union. And since Iran was not a member of the Security Council, it really had no say. And I think they also missed it. We all saw it when the resolution was adopted, because it was adopted in a big hurry. So that created a little bit of tension. So my point with North Korea is that in international law, as Paul will mention, we have this concept of pacta sunt servanda. International agreements are meant to be observed. And we cannot have a government in one country of a country signing an agreement and the next country coming in and denouncing it. Otherwise, the whole international system collapses. So successive governments are bound by sovereign agreements reached by their country at the international level. But many times this doesn't happen in the US. And many countries are frustrated because you negotiate with the US administration, and then the US Congress gets into the act in order to approve it and adds various conditions to it. So if you are a negotiator, you've already negotiated once. And I mean, we found it to our expense in Canada with the NAFTA, and now the revised version of the trade agreement, where the US doesn't win something on tariffs on soft lumber or whatever, but then finds a sneaky way of putting them back on. Same thing happened to the Bombardier plane, which eventually they put a 300% duty on it. And now this Buy America provision is completely against this new revised US-Canada trade agreement. And I'm always surprised that Canada never pushes back with the Buy Canada clause. And when I was traveling with Foreign Affairs, when I would go with them to the NPT meetings, many Canadian foreign affairs people would be traveling on US airlines to Europe. And I would say, well, why are you not traveling on Canadian Pacific? CP was then, or Air Canada. And they had no good answer. And I said, well, the American delegation only flies on US airlines. So why is not the Canadian delegation flying on the 2 Canadian airlines? Why are they going on American or Lufthansa or whatever? So it's partly our fault as well of not, standing up for our rights. So I've sort of digressed from that. And I hope whether Paul might wish to say something on this particular complaint that I made.
Can I, sorry, Paul, did you want to add?
Well, I mean, just, protectionism, can rear its ugly head in, a number of places. I don't think overall it's the way to go. It's a we have this obviously pushback from the globalization experience, which has not been beneficial in all cases. But just to echo Tariq's point too, it's the caprice that the Trump administration showed regarding an agreement that its predecessor had entered into, which it sends a chill. I mean, because as he rightly notes, the rulers in Pyongyang looking at this saying, oh, why pursue any kind of denuclearization agreement with this gang in Washington, because the next administration can just walk away and we are left high and dry. So it really did erode a certain credibility. I'm sure President George H.W. Bush was turning in his grave, because that was a certain assumption that when a sovereign country entered into agreement, it was going to last. It wasn't going to be subject to the political caprice of a new government. And you can see how this can be corrosive of any sort of more sustained international cooperation. If everyone is concerned that an election change or a coup or whatever is going to lead to the repudiation of carefully negotiated accords.
I might just add that, the United States also has this system of extended sanctions, where they force other countries to observe US sanctions. And the EU never really stood up in terms of the JCPOA, when the Iranians went to the European Union and said, okay, the US is not going to trade with us, how about you? And the European Union threw their hands up and said, well, we cannot force our companies to trade with you because the Americans will sanction them. So this again is this long reach of US sanctions, where they want to apply their domestic law on other countries and international financial entities and corporations. And there really is no pushback against that.
Specifically about the British decision in their nuclear review to lift the cap on Trident missiles, which seems like a ridiculous thing in practice. Like I just can't imagine it ever actually being implemented. So is that just sort of a signal to somebody? Is it hot air? Like, what was that about?
Method sponsored a discussion of that very issue with myself and two British observers. And I thought a key point that emerged from the Brits was that you have to see this as Boris Johnson's love of swagger was the term that they used. That his effort, to make Great Britain great again, was to put this emphasis on increasing the stockpile for there's no strategic logic in doing that. It is an expression of kind of certain jingoistic one-upmanship, but it does lethal damage to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I mean, up to now, the UK was the most progressive of the 5 nuclear weapon states, the ones that promoted the idea of transparency about their holdings, minimum deterrence, and for them to back away from all of this, it is very destructive. And I must say, even more conservative observers of British security policy have been pretty critical of this move.
So Liz, I was going to say that Boris Johnson offered a very generous rise of £1.15 per week to the nurses of the National Health Service for their services on COVID, but he has more than $10 billion to buy new submarines, new nuclear warheads, and new submarine-launched ballistic missiles.
Yeah.
So that shows you the value judgment that Boris Johnson has. But actually, there's more to this. The United Kingdom wants to increase the number of warheads that it wants on the submarine-launched missiles, which is why it needs this extra number of nuclear warheads. So instead of having 1 or 2, they want to put 3 or 4 or more, because they have what they call the Moscow criterion. that the UK alone on its own should be able to overcome Moscow's anti-missile defenses and destroy it without necessarily relying on the United States to do this. And an even more egregious problem here is that the warheads that the United Kingdom uses on its submarines, the designs for that come from the United States, because the submarine-launched ballistic missiles are leased from the US. They're not British missiles. They have a common pool. British submarines go to this port in Georgia. They load the submarines and they put the British warhead on it. And if they fire a dummy missile, they pay the US the cost of it. Otherwise, they pay them the rent. And then the missiles go back for servicing and refueling and so on. So this is a clear violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But then loyal allies like us in Canada and Germany and others, when I raise this issue with people, they just look the other way and roll their eyes and want me to disappear into the ground and not raise these uncomfortable questions. And this is also an issue for the missile technology control regime, the sharing of strategic ballistic missiles, because the missile technology control regimes restricts transfer of missiles with a range of 500 kilometers or more, or a capacity to carry a warhead more than 300 kilograms. So there's all these hypocrisies now.
I think you're focusing largely on preparing for the NPT conference review, right? Can you give us some, your sense of where that's going and what I see you're trying to have it deferred another year. Tell us about that.
So this conference was supposed to be held in March, April last year, which would have marked the 50th anniversary of the entry into force of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and also the 25th anniversary of its indefinite extension, for which Canada played a very key role in 1995. So I believe that we in Canada have a certain responsibility towards this treaty and its longevity and ensuring that it is observed. So because of COVID, it was postponed to January, but the geniuses that postponed it to January overlapped with the dates where the transition would take place in the US. Either President Trump would have taken office again, or in this case, as we now know, it was President Biden. But then again, because of the COVID situation, it's now been kicked off to the month of August. And later this month, it will be decided by the New York delegations whether to still hold it in August and whether the situation is safe enough to travel internationally and what the COVID situation is in New York. But the New York delegations, I'm told, are insisting that this conference has to be held this year and it should not be postponed. And my position is that the New York delegations have zero expertise on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Disarmament issues are done where Paul served as disarmament ambassador in Geneva at the Conference on Disarmament. And nuclear verification and peaceful uses of nuclear energy have always been done in Vienna. So this is where the expertise on the NPT lies. And we should have the review conference in Vienna rather than in New York. But there is a lot of...
Are you getting anywhere with that argument? I know you said it 6 or 8 months ago.
No, I'm not getting anywhere because people still, some people want to go to New York to buy a cheap iPhone, to buy a cheap suit. And I keep telling them that, the price of an iPhone in Vienna now is the same as in New York.
Come on, you're not serious that that's any...
I am serious.
That this is a rationale that is actually spoken?
This is what people don't say, but it's part of the rationale. It's not all of the rationale. So I think the COVID situation is going to sort this out. It is in the interests of those who want to go to New York for their own health to make sure that everyone coming to New York, civil society, journalists, diplomats, all have been vaccinated. And that is not going to happen. And can you imagine spending a whole month, 20 working days in a conference room with 300 to 120 people for 20 working days, 6 hours a day? I mean, it's asking for trouble. So I, at the moment, am a lonely voice. People say, that's just Tariq speaking, because he doesn't want to go to New York. Anyway.
Meta, on that note, we have things scheduled for 1:30 that we're a bit later.
Okay, this has been extremely interesting. Thank you very much. And come back again. We'll be doing this every Tuesday. Another schmooze. Okay.
Thank
Bye.
you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.